You know, I just like, man, suddenly something's happening. So I'm just...
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Juliana Crowley, the Executive Director of NARAL Pro-Choice Montana Foundation. We are a nonpartisan organization working to increase the number of informed decisions made about reproductive health here in Montana. Every year at about this time, NARAL Pro-Choice Montana puts on our annual Voices Power Politics event with our Students for Choice campus group here at the University of Montana. And this year we were really excited for the opportunity to expand that event and bring attention to this particular race. We are very pleased to be able to host tonight's debate and forum with the candidates running for Montana's lone congressional seat, with the New Leaders Council of Montana and 6 sponsoring organizations, including Montana Women Vote, Students for Choice, the Pride Foundation, Montana Small Business Alliance, Pi Sigma Alpha Epsilon Mu, and Women's Voices for the Earth. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. My name is Chris Jackson, and I am the co-director of New Leaders Council Montana, based here in Missoula. New Leaders Council is a 501c3 across the country that trains, recruits young emerging leaders in diverse sectors, and Missoula is one of 20 cities that participates in that institute. We're halfway through the institute right now, and our fellows, there are 12 of them this year, are in the process of planning their fellows fundraiser. So if you feel inspired, their fellows fundraiser will be at the Stensrip building on April 27th. More information will be coming on that. And I have the honor of introducing Jennifer Gursky as one of the co-moderators tonight. Jen is currently finishing her position as president of the Association of Students for the University of Montana, known as ASUM. And she also is the president of Montana Associated Students, with a voice on the board of the Montana Board of Regents. And she's an alumna of New Leaders Council Montana and serves on the board. So thank you, Jen, for co-moderating.
We have another co-moderator, Pat Williams. He is a former Montana legislator representing House District 23 of Silver Bow County from 1966 to 1970. After serving as the executive assistant in Montana's Representative John Melcher from 1969 to 1971, he was a member of the Governor's Employment and Training Council from 1972 to 1978 and served on the Montana Reapportionment Commission from 1972 to 1973. In 1978, Pat Williams was elected to represent Montana's 1st District in the 96th U.S. Congress. He won re-election in 1980, 1982, 1984, 1986, 1988, 1990. In 1992, Montana lost its 2nd seat in U.S. House of Representatives, but Williams maintained representation of Montana until election in his final term in 1994, and he served 9 terms as U.S. Congressman for Montana. So, thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for being in attendance tonight. On behalf of the students of the University of Montana, I welcome you to what I lovingly refer to as my own stomping grounds, but they are my current stomping grounds and not my old stomping grounds. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to go through a little bit of the format of tonight, so we are all clear and the candidates are clear, and we have a very clear and fair and transparent process. Tonight's event will be about an hour and a half long. The first 60 minutes, we have prepared questions from each of the sponsoring organizations. Each candidate will have 1 minute to introduce themselves, 1.5 minutes to respond to the questions. After that point, we will then have 30 minutes for audience questions. I'll give you a flag, but go ahead and there should be yellow tags that are right in front of you. Those are what you can mark your questions on. I will let you know we have facilitators that will come and collect your questions, but I'll let you know because it's going to be at the end of the sponsoring organization's questions, and then we'll take audience participation questions. Each of those questions will also be allotted a minute and a half of response time. After the response time, we will have then a 30-minute meet and greet opportunity for you to meet each of the candidates up here. I want to remind everybody that we're looking for candidates to talk about their stances on the issues. Please refrain from any personal comments or attacks. If one should arise, the candidate for which the comment was directed will be given 30 seconds to respond. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Pat Williams up here to get this kicked off.
I join in my thanks to the co-sponsoring groups. This is the way town after town, city after city, democracy works, our brand of it. So we thank you all for being here, and especially the sponsoring groups. And I want to thank the candidates. You know, I've sat in that seat, and I know what it is. Thank you for taking a big chunk out of you and maybe your family's life to do this. We are all greatly appreciative. As Jen mentioned, we have questions from the sponsors, and you're going to ask questions, but seniority allows me to ask the first question. And it's based upon my own 18 years of experience as Montana's member of Congress. So candidates, the winner of this in the general election, so the eventual winner, will represent more people than anyone else of the 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. And you will represent them spread over the second largest geographic area in the country for any member representation, Alaska only being bigger than the Montana single member district. Nobody has to serve in the Congress to at least understand that that's a chore. That's a chore. On top of that, you have to do it in a 2-year term. And then you have to run for re-election. And you have to raise money. And you have to get around this state. Now my question is, have you thought about, and if so, how are you going to do that and represent? How are you going to do all of that, take all of that difficulty, and represent people in a 2-year term? David, being as you're the dude from Missoula, you have home ground here. Let's start with you and go down, and then we will split up the way we rotate the candidates given the answers. David?
Well, 2 things. One, I think the question begs the answer that we absolutely need campaign finance reform in this country. It is a travesty and obscene how much time and money is spent in these campaigns and how much time on the parts of candidates is spent dialing for dollars, begging for cash, and returning every weekend or so to their home district, essentially to campaign for re-election. What I'm going to say now, though, is a little counterintuitive. I think our folks in Congress have spent way too much time in the air and airports, commuting back and forth to their home district. You all are sending me to Congress to represent the state of Montana to try to work with my colleagues back there and get some things done, not to spend 4 days a week in transit back and forth to the home district. And that's not to say I'm not coming back here. I absolutely am, and will do my darndest to get around this huge district, as Pat mentioned. But I think part of the discord and ineffectiveness of Congress is the result of folks not actually spending enough time together and gaining any sort of collegiality to work together. I will try to change that when I'm back in Washington, D.C. working for you all.
I kind of take a different approach. We do need, my idea is we need to, I just need to represent the way I lived while I was here. And I've lived here my whole life. I know how the people of Montana think and what they value and what trust to uphold. But going to Washington and being infused in basically a foreign culture is a little dangerous. And I think it's important to come home as often as possible and talk with the constituents. And, you know, I like Montana. I like driving around Montana. I like seeing all the different parts of Montana. And I think it's important to do that. Thank you.
I ran my campaign the way that I intend to govern, and that's by finding out, identifying what's important to Montanans, and then not only representing it, but living it as part of my lifestyle. And so what I do in my campaign is I make sure that I put people first. I don't take money from special interest PACs. I don't sign pledges for special interest PACs. And I look to the Montana Constitution to find out values that are important to Montanans. Because when I have a foundation derived from what Montanans have told me that I take to Washington, I'll be able to represent the whole state and our values more in an easier manner because the people of Montana have spoken. And so I look to the Montana Constitution and I say there are values in it that we voted on in 2010, and they include a clean and healthful environment, open government, right of privacy, public education, American Indian heritage, and a whole host of other things. So to the first part of the question as to how I can represent such a broad state when I'm gone, it's because I'm rooted in what I do and what Montanans have told me they want out of their government. How do I do it on a dime? How do we do it with less money? I do it with social media. I can reach all of Montana very efficiently, and the Billings Gazette and a few other papers around the state highlighted the work I do with social media, and that allows me to accomplish more, keeping my overhead low. I don't have to spend as much time on the phone asking for dollars. Thank you.
I don't know how far away we are from having 2 seats, but if you all would go forth and multiply, might solve the problem. My mother was from eastern Montana, from Terry. She was born on a homestead there, and although she ended up on a dirt farm in the eastern shore of Maryland, I feel like I have both some agricultural and eastern Montana blood in my veins. I've been in Bozeman for 20 years. That's a pretty diverse place, I could tell you that too. And all over the state, I served on the Montana Humanities Council for 4 years, great 4 years, and we used to call it bringing humanities to the boonies, which meant going all over the state. And I ate, what is the local delicacy in Miles City that you eat with cocktail sauce? Yeah, that was, so it's pretty diverse cultural experiences. I've also been on all of the Indian reservations in Montana, and that was before I ever thought about running. It's because of the research I do and the work I do in my policy work with Native American policy. So I think I have a sense of the diversity of the state. I like to think of my students, about 300 a year, as a broad geographic base. I've had the opportunity to visit many of their homes in the last 12 months, from Glendive to Oilmont, to Hamilton and Whitefish and Libby, and all the B towns, Bozeman, Butte, Billings, and Missoula in between. So I love this state, and I will spend a lot of time continuing to travel throughout the state as I elected.
First off, I don't think anybody should move to Washington, D.C. to do this job. I think you get sucked into the vortex that's inside the Beltway, and it's hard to find your way out. So I think the most important thing actually is to pledge to continue to commute back to Montana every week. And as hard as that is, you can make it easier. I agree. We use a lot of social media in our campaign, but there is no substitute for driving around. And since the early 2000s, I've been driving around the state, building businesses, talking to entrepreneurs, seeing what's going on in all of the corners of the state. And it is the most fun thing I get to do. Even on this campaign, this is the most fun thing, is to be here, is to be able to talk to the folks who are in their backyards, to be in your coffee shops, your restaurants, your subways. We were just in the subway. All of the local places. And by the way, can I just make a plug for Cold Smoke coming back to Whitefish, because we're crushed that Cold Smoke isn't going to be up there anymore. But it's that kind of stuff when you get to know communities. I will, in some weeks, I will literally fly to the east side and drive all the way across home to get to the west side and stop all along the way just to see folks and talk to folks and see what's going on in the backyard, because that's how you stay in touch with what's going on, not inside the Beltway.
Having been a member of Common Cause from the very beginning in 1970 through the 90s and being state chairman a couple of those years here in Montana, I have seen the horrific cost that the big money extracts from most politicians. And I have worked all those years against the influence, the excessive money and the influence that it has on our government and our politics. It is only now, after all these years, that most people now are beginning to see it, because it's been such an extreme amount of more and more and more in these last 10 years. But I have already, I don't like the word pledge because of Norquist and his thing, but I have pledged not to take PAC, corporate, or any kind of special interest money. And I think most of us might have taken that pledge also. So I won't have to stay in Washington to make a lot of phone calls and attend a lot of fundraisers. And the proof is in the pudding. When I was in the, not in, but when I worked for the JCPenney company, they were going to transfer me after I'd gotten out of college and after I got out of the Vietnam conflict. I said, I want to stay here. And so I've already said I want to stay here a couple of different times to different job opportunities. So I will stay in Montana because I won't be fundraising, and it's a beautiful state.
Is this on? Oh, great. Well, first of all, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to come to Missoula. When Pat asked this question, it reminded me of something I read many years ago that former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, once said, that when people were in a dizzy about some votes, he said, if you take care of your constituents, then they'll take care of you. So don't worry about re-election, and you have my commitment that I'm not working hard to go to the U.S. House and then the next day worry about re-election. I'm there to do work for the people of Montana. Second of all is I will continue to do what I did in the Montana legislature and in my community. I'm going to listen to the people of Montana, not to the corporate special interest. I've not done that in the legislature, and that's how I got some great bills passed, like insurance reform. And last of all is that we're going there to solve some problems for Montanans, and I think as I talk to people, whether they're in coffee shops or at gas stations, they just want some common sense back in Washington, D.C. They want someone to break the gridlock, and that's my commitment to every Montanan, whether they live in the far corners or they live in our urban centers. So let's go back there and not worry about re-election or other things.
I think appropriately we started with how do you serve Montanans, and now we will start with please introduce yourselves. Please feel free to hold your applause. There's a lot of questions tonight, and if you would like to show support, that's amazing, but please feel free to hold your applause. We're going to actually start from the other end of the table with Ms. Gillen. We'll have a minute to introduce. Please say your name and one reason you decided to hop in the race.
Great. As I told you, I'm Kim Gillen. I'm a state senator from Billings, and I also head up a program for MSU Billings at the Montana Women's Prison. Montana has only one voice in the U.S. House of Representatives, and that voice needs to be effective and it needs to be experienced. It needs to speak clearly, responsibly, and strongly on behalf of Montanans. And that is why I'm running for Congress. As I will share with you later, I have a reputation as a problem solver, and the most important thing, it's time to break the gridlock and bring Montana common sense to the U.S. House.
Like many of you in the audience, I've done a lot of things in my life, and I like to think I've done most of them well. But there's one thing I do not do well, and that is answer questions in a forum like this clearly. If some of my answers are not clear, please go to my website. I've got specific items on each policy and position. And also, after the meeting, we'll be glad to visit with you. My father died when I was in elementary school. I was raised by two strong women, my mother and my older sister, and my mother never remarried. All the candidates up here are probably closer to the Democratic base than I may be. But I think I'm closer to the people that will in fact decide whether Republican or Democrat goes to Congress for Montana in November, the moderates and the centrists. We all know, everyone in this room knows, that big money has a stranglehold on our government. And I'm going to break that stranglehold, and that's why I'm running.
And I'm Diane Smith from Whitefish, and it's wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you all. I'm running because we have to fix the situation that we're in. DC has stopped working, and our leadership has stopped making decisions that make sense for us. I'm the person up here who has created good high-tech jobs in Montana. I know about entrepreneurship and building industries and small businesses. I know that the vast majority of businesses in Montana have less than 4 employees, and I know what it takes to help them thrive. I also know that to have a conversation about Social Security and Medicare and to protect those two fabulous programs, you're going to have a conversation about financials. And you're going to have a conversation about how to make that money work. And I know how to do that. I was raised by 2 fighters to be a fighter, and you'll hear more about that later on tonight. My parents were both World War II vets, and they taught me to fight for the people who don't have a voice, for the people who are discriminated against, and to find solutions, and that's why I'm running. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Frankie Wilmer, and I'm running for the U.S. House of Representatives because we need people in Congress who understand that we're all in this together. And I understand that. We do need to restore the middle class, to rebuild the economy, and to restore the American dream. But we need people who understand what the American dream is. And for me, it's personal, and I have a clear concept of it. It's that every person in this country should have a fair chance to make the most of their abilities, to provide a decent life for themselves and their families, and to pass those fair chances on to the next generation. And we're seeing an attack on that concept, an attack on the very core of the American promise. And I think we cannot let that happen. For me, it's personal because that hard work and fair chances enabled me to change my life from being a waitress and single divorced mom to a college professor, author of 3 books, expert on national security and foreign policy, chair of the Montana Human Rights Commission. And so for me, I think it's very personal that we have to get in there and turn things around and make this political system economy work for all of us.
I'm Rob Stutz, and I'm running for Congress because I think we need a government that puts people first. A government that not just tells people that they're the focus of the work they do, that shows them. And so in my campaign, I tell people, you come first. I don't take money from special interests, and I don't sign the pledges. And yes, that makes it difficult to raise as much money as we can expect the Republican will raise, but it also gives us the stronger message, and it shows people something important, that their interests are first. And so when I talk about the Constitution, and I talk about the values that people in Montana have told me are priorities, I'm showing them that I put people first. And we need a government that focuses on how to put people out in front of the special interests of the corporations and of all the other distractions there are in Washington, D.C. So when you see my campaign and you see what I'm doing, you'll know that the focus is putting people first, because that's how we're going to win in November, by showing that we're something different than what the Republicans have as their approach.
My name is Jason Ward. I'm a construction program manager for Crow Tribe. I have a small farm. I was raised on a ranch. And the real reason I'm running is because we're going down the wrong direction. The way the government is working is not sustainable. We're piling on the debt, and we're deindustrializing America at the same time. So all of our jobs are leaving. First, it was just the blue-collar jobs, but now it's starting to be the white-collar jobs. Education, research and development are all starting to trend that way. And I'm tired of being represented by people that talk for a living. and that don't really have their heart with the workers. And I think that we need somebody there that will stand up for the American worker.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Strohmeyer from Missoula, Montana. 2 years ago, this night, across town in the Missoula City Council chambers, the council began a public hearing debating an ordinance that I was the co-sponsor of. Sometime after midnight on the morning of April 13th, 2010, we passed a non-discrimination ordinance for Missoula that ensured that no one in our community was discriminated against based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Now, in the face of that, some folks came up to me and asked, don't you have anything better to do than work on something like that? And my response then, as now, is an emphatic no. There is no more solemn and important task for an elected official than to ensure that the civil rights and human rights of our community members are protected. I've done that here in Missoula, Montana, and I'll do that as your representative in the U.S. Congress.
We will now move into the sponsor organization questions. Alex, thank you so much for timing questions tonight. I would like to remind the candidates to pay attention to Alex and that we will have a minute and a half to respond, starting with Ms. Wilmer and going to the right and looping around. The first question tonight comes from the Montana Small Business Alliance. Small business owners understand that their success is tied to the well-being of their communities and their customers. We know that success depends on the public investments made possible by our tax dollars, investments like public education, roads, bridges, and protecting our water and air, investments that promote a good quality of life and strong local economies. Results from a recent national survey found that 75% of small business owners feel that their own small business is harmed when corporations use tax loopholes to dodge taxes, and a strong majority thinks millionaires should pay more taxes. If elected to Congress, what will you do to ensure that the wealthiest Americans and corporations contribute adequately to support the public investments that enable our small businesses to succeed?
Support the Buffett rule, for starters, which is to bring some tax fairness to our system. We need to close loopholes. We have a situation now where the top 20 or so corporations not only don't pay taxes, they get a refund. $54 million came back to General Electric the same year that they cut 18,000 jobs. So it's an absolute myth that tax cuts for big corporations create jobs. It's time to call them on that. Absolutely, small businesses don't outsource. It's the one area of our economy that doesn't outsource. They deliver goods and services to people almost face to face. And the greatest accountability is in businesses that deliver goods and services face to face to their customers and get feedback. So we need to stop outsourcing, or at least stop encouraging it and rewarding it with tax cuts. We might even reward some people for bringing jobs back to the United States. So those are some starting points, I think, that we need to bring fairness. We need to look at the corporate tax structure and the loopholes that are rewarding policies that hurt small businesses and hurt our jobs here, and turn that around.
Our tax code is crazy, and it incents all of the worst kinds of behaviors, and we need to fix that. And we're not going to fix it overnight, but it's a process that we absolutely need to get going with. I wrote a book called thenewrural.com about the role of technology in rural economic development. As an entrepreneur, I took a business from what investors call the two guys, a dog and an idea phase, which is literally when you're driving around trying to get your business started. And we took it through the valley of death phase, which is what the second phase that investors call. That's when your income and your revenues or your income and your expenses are so far apart from one another, you never think that you'll be in the black and profitable. We turned out to become in the black and profitable, thank heavens. But it taught me a lot about what it takes for small business to thrive. There are three pillars to that stool. It's access to infrastructure. And that's physical infrastructure like broadband capabilities. It's access to intellectual capital. our kids educated well enough? Do we have what we need to build teams of geniuses and access to financial capital? And there's a lot we can do in all three areas of that to help small businesses thrive, in addition to fixing a tax code that incents so much of bad behaviors that we need to get past.
I've decided to try and make my answers more clear by reading some notes. So I'm going to start something new instead of doing it ad lib. Something is seriously wrong when the unemployment rate is 9% and the average 2011 CEO pay is $9.6 million. There is some middle ground. There has to be middle ground. What I would support are 3 new individual income tax brackets, 12, 22, and 28, with elimination of nearly all itemized deductions except earned income tax credit, child credit, mortgage interest on your principal residence, employer-provided health insurance, charitable giving, and retirement plans. The wealthy use itemized deductions to shield a lot of income from taxes, and that would eliminate a lot of wealthy, not the millionaires, billionaires, but a lot of wealthy people that shield a lot of money. I would also support capital gains and dividends being taxed as ordinary income. They're taxed at 15% now, and they'd probably end up being in that 28% bracket, be just about doubled. My real estate developer friends, hedge fund managers, and so on. I would also support corporate taxes from 35 to go to 29 and getting rid of all their exemptions and tax loopholes. I do not support the profits that are currently left overseas. They're negotiating with the Congress to lower the tax rate on their overseas earnings. There's trillions of dollars overseas. I'm not in favor of those dollars coming back tax-free. And the estate tax is due to expire. It's supposed to go to $5 million and 55%. I support $3 million and 45%.
When I served in the Montana legislature, I was fortunate to spend 6 of my 8 sessions on the first House and then Senate tax. And State Senator Ron Erickson knows that every session we battled, we call it the battle of the special interest, where the well-funded corporate lobbyists wanted to continue to make Montana's own tax code look like Swiss cheese. We already know that that happens to the federal government. So I've had some firsthand experience in knowing how these special interest tax really are shifted on to middle-class folks. And what makes it more difficult is that when they're shifted, that means that families have a more difficult time in sending their kids to college. And let's face it, we know that one of the best ways to grow the economy is to have a well-educated and well-trained workforce. So in that respect, I was an advocate for small businesses and passed a couple of pieces of legislation that actually expanded the training resources that were available, targeted specifically at small businesses. So when we get to the federal level, I agree that we need some significant tax reform, and we particularly need to look at the dollars the lost tax revenue that we have that's going to multinational corporations. It translates into almost $484 a person that we are using to subsidize people to send jobs overseas. That's common sense, and we need to make our tax code more friendly, and I'm committed to that.
So I work for a small business here in Missoula, a consulting firm that does historical research. We could be located just about anywhere in the country as long as there's a university, as long as there's good internet connection. We locate here because of those things, but also because of the quality of life here in this valley in western Montana. And a piece of that is investing in infrastructure in our communities. And that's the connection and the nexus, I think, here to holding everyone accountable to pay their fair share. I believe firmly that to whom much is given, much is required. And a part of that for me means making sure that millionaires, the most wealthy in this country, pay their fair share, and maybe that means a minimum tax of some sort for those individuals. It means making sure that we don't have loopholes for large corporations that essentially allows them to launder money overseas and not pay a dime hardly in taxes. We need to close up those loopholes, and we need to make sure we have worldwide reporting of income and profits. The Buffett rule was mentioned. I would certainly agree with that also. And I think finally we need to think about and seriously think about rolling back Bush-era tax cuts that have done nothing to invest in this country. We need nation building at home rather than laundering money overseas.
I think really the tax code, the current tax code, is just a big shell game. They give everybody little peanuts, little here and there to keep everybody happy, but really it's just there to, it's so complex to give special interest their kickback. And really that kind of corrupt document just needs to be burnt and start over. If you can't do your taxes on a postcard, there's something wrong. I mean, when it takes the average person a week's pay to do their taxes, or to pay somebody to do their taxes, because it's too complex for an individual to understand, that's not right. Really, that's a form of tyranny. That's how laws were portrayed for thousands of years, written in a language nobody could understand. And here in America, we shouldn't have that. If we just had a tax code that businesses could depend on and knew what to plan for, there would be an economic boom. How can you start a project and plan for a project 5 years down the road when you have no idea what the rules are going to be at the time? And so that's what I think about the tax code. Thank you.
In this room and across Montana and across the country, people are saying, why is Mitt Romney only paying 13.9% taxes and I'm paying a lot more even though I make a lot less? And they're saying, why are these corporations that make hundreds of millions or billions of dollars paying nothing in taxes? And the reason is simple. It's because the tax code is structured in their favor. And we've identified a lot of the problems. But now let's look at what the solution is. The solution is not closing some tax loopholes, because that'll never happen until we have a political solution, until we have a political system that isn't dependent on special interests buying influence, getting their deductions and their exclusions and their exemptions from the tax code. And so the first step to solving the tax problem is to say, how can we get our political system back on track? And let's be clear here. Our political system is not broken. Our political system still lets us get exactly the person we vote for. But it's corrupted by money. It's corrupted by people buying attention, buying influence. And so what we need is we need to get the corruption out of politics, because we will get exactly the person we vote for. It's just that we've been voting for the people who take the big bucks from the special interest groups. And so I say, to solve the tax problems, to make sure Mitt Romney and the other corporations pay their fair share, let's get our political system back on track by supporting people, elected officials, not dependent on special interest money.
Perhaps we should note that every candidate who has filed for the U.S. Congress was invited to be here, including these Democratic candidates as well as the 4 Republican candidates. Everybody has a reasonable right of refusal, and our friends, the Republican candidates, chose not to be here, but we do want you to know that we intended this to be a nonpartisan debate. For my part, had the Republicans been here, I was going to sit out there, and I was urging everybody to have a Republican, a known Republican, be the moderator. That would have been as fair as we're trying to be here, but we do want you to know that this was to have been an entirely fair and nonpartisan debate. Now, this question from Montana's New Leaders Council. The national debate centering on education has run the gamut from the call to dissolve the Department of Education to President Obama's challenging of all Americans to pursue some form of education for at least 1 year following their high school graduation, and the development of state-led Common Core standards for all of K-12 education. Now, for the candidates, in your opinion, what is the proper role of the federal government in providing excellent public education for all? And if elected, how would you work to ensure American public education serves the current and future needs of this country's students? let's start again the way we did the last time and swing this way, and then in the next round we'll change it. So I believe, Frankie, I think you started last time, didn't you? Yeah, go ahead again then.
Thank you. Well, first of all, the United States has gone from being the third highest ranked education system publicly in the world to 15, I think it is, most recently. This is what happens when you elect people who just want to cut government, for one thing. We have in Montana, I think, the distinction of getting just about the biggest bang for our buck in public education, however, because our students in 4th and 8th grade are ranking 1st and 3rd in math and science. This is astounding. We're doing something right here. So the question is, how do we find that balance between what we're doing right, at the same time you'd be serving in Congress and making decisions and influencing policies that would hold for the whole country and our whole system. I think the role of the federal government, it's a great question, is equity, civil rights in education, equal access, and standards and quality of education in the public sector. I'm a Jeffersonian on this. It is the method by which people can change their lives, and it is the thing that secures our democracy. I personally think that we have put a lot of emphasis on math and science, and that's great. It's been particularly good for our universities here. But we are also lacking in civics education and watching our civil liberties kind of be melted away because we're not vigilant and don't understand what's at risk there. So I would definitely want to see more higher education support again. That's why tuition is rising, and continue with the quality of public education and return to where we were.
We have to make sure the public stays in public education. And that's because it is vital to our success as a nation. Both our national security, our economic success, our quality of life all hinges on this. And it is, the federal government has a huge role here. And they have a huge role to ensure, again, the overall standards for what it is that we're trying to achieve. But I also have to say, one-size-fits-all policies rarely work well for a state like Montana because we are unique, because our rural schools frequently look different from big urban center schools and so forth. So we have to have flexibility there. But one of the things we can do, for example, we can share, at the federal level, we can share best practices much easier and better and more than we have been. For example, there's a school system in Arizona that has turned long commute school buses into internet hotspots so that the kids can access the internet on hour-long commutes to and from. And when I asked folks at the MEA-MFT if we were doing that in Montana, everybody said no. And I said, well, how do we get the word out to you then that it's working really well in Arizona? We need to use our federal system to make sure that the best ideas are being made available to everybody.
As a former certified schoolroom teacher, 5 through 12 science, and by the way, that was the hardest job I've ever had. I spent a couple years in the classroom. I know that schools, money, teachers are not the problem. The real problem is society's impact on the students. I would strongly support any legislation to enhance the teachers' ability to do their job and parents and caregivers to prepare students for learning, which means WIC, Violence Against Women's Act, all kinds of things to support the family and the student to get to school to be ready to learn. It's a big project, but that's what I would support. I also support reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Obama administration blueprint for education, but would add provisions to help the most disadvantaged students in these groups, like children in foster care, juvenile detention, and other areas of concentration, so that their requirements wouldn't be quite as stringent, but they would still have requirements to be passed. I would also limit the use of tax dollars for private sectarian or non-sectarian education programs and oppose their use in for-profit educations.
The ability to get a good education is a personal issue to me. when I was among the first generation of among my cousins to go to a university. And when I graduated, I had lots of student loans. I worked as a Teamster during the summer. And on graduation day, I went to close my checking account, and I had all of $1 there. I only had $1, but what I did have is I had a college degree. And for me personally, and I think for all Montanans, having some post-secondary training or education can open many doors. In fact, there's a study that shows that by 2018, 62% of the jobs in Montana will require some type of post-secondary education. So for me, what I feel the federal role is critical in making sure that education is affordable and accessible. And we do that by making sure that Pell Grants stay where they are if are not increased. They are not welfare, as the current Congressman Reberg said. We need to make sure they're not only their Pell Grants, but the American Opportunity Tax Credit stays in there so families, middle-class families, can help, it'll help them send their children to college. And the other thing is we need to make sure that graduate student loans, subsidized loans, continue to have the subsidies, because without that, folks won't be able to go. You know what, one thing I will work on is either significantly reforming or rethinking No Child Left Behind, because I think it doesn't help places like Montana.
So my wife Gretchen and I have been married 20 years now, but I got to confess to all of you, there's a woman who I've known for more years than that, and her name is Sally Mae. Every month I continue to cut a check for my student loans, and so I have that monthly reminder of my connection to the educational system in this country. I was the first member of my family since my grandparents homesteaded up near Vida in northeast Montana around the turn of the century to have graduated from college. So I know the value of Pell Grants, student loans, work study. These are all things we need to continue to invest in as a nation. Let's think seriously about maybe capping the interest rate on student loans at a more acceptable level, a level that could be more paid back more reasonably. Something is seriously wrong when I can go and remortgage my house right now and get a better interest rate than what I'm currently paying on student loans. So we've got work to do. Every day I take my kids down to the bus stop near my house on Pine Street, a 5-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son who attend Lowell Elementary School here in Missoula. And they're my tangible reminder of the importance of public education in this country. I know what great jobs those teachers do in the classroom, so I have zero tolerance for those individuals who continually demean and degrade our public school teachers. We need to invest in them and their professional development, and ultimately, the treasure in the treasure estate is not what we can claw out of the ground, it's the minds of our kids.
We need a system that's flexible enough to allow our brighter kids to reach their full potential, but rigid enough to make sure that everyone has a fundamental education. We also need to make sure that our publicly funded schools teach a little bit about government, because in my school, the last real government class I had was about 7th grade. Everything after that was history. And so it was kind of it's hard to get interested in a process that most people don't understand. And I think that's reflected in our voter turnout. And so we have some improvements to do. We do, I mean, it's an important program and it should not be cut. And I think it's kind of obvious. But our education system needs to prepare our students to enter college without having to take remedial courses. We need to hold our public schools accountable and make sure that they're providing a quality education.
So I'm a big proponent of public education, and we're really fortunate here in Montana to have Denise Juneau as our Superintendent of Public Instruction. She has gotten the federal government to do what Congress didn't have the will to do. She got No Child Left Behind waivers for every state because Congress was unable to address the problems that are implicit in No Child Left Behind. And those are problems that I intend to address when I get to Congress. But let me tell you a little bit about my background with public education and why it's so important to me. And I'd like to do a little shout out to Cold Springs Elementary and Russell Elementary here in Missoula, winners of Blue Ribbon Awards from the United States Department of Education. And that's one important role for the federal government, is to provide resources for local schools, even though we have local control in Montana, to be able to achieve excellence. My background in public education started when I rode my big wheel to my brother's kindergarten class in Belfry, Montana, for my first and only day of preschool there. And it continued through Billings, where I went to elementary school, and Libby, here at the University of Montana, where I got my law degree, and then professionally as an attorney when I represented school districts, public school districts around Montana. And that took me to work at the United States Department of Education, where I worked in the General Counsel's office on national education issues under both the Bush and the Obama administrations. And that led me to work as the chief legal counsel at the Montana legislature this past session, where I was responsible for reviewing bills, including bills with educational issues.
I would like to remind each of us that there are yellow squares that should be on the arm of your chair. And in a couple of questions, we will come and collect those questions. So just keep in mind that there is time for you yourselves to ask questions of these candidates. The next question that we have comes from NARAL Pro Choice Montana and Students for Choice. We are actually going to start with Mr. Stutz and go to the left this time and loop around. The question is, because of healthcare reform, a long list of preventative healthcare services will be available to women without a copay. Women across the country will no longer have to struggle when trying to receive reproductive health care through their insurance provider and will have access to the form of contraception that works best for them. However, since the Obama administration's decision, some politicians in Congress are fighting to repeal the no-cost birth control rule, even considering an amendment that would allow insurers and employers to deny coverage for any health benefits they deem immoral. Do you agree that birth control and other preventative services should be covered under healthcare reform, and why? Second, and if elected, how would you be an advocate for women's access to reproductive health care in the U.S. House? Mr. Stutz?
It's a great question because it highlights one of the main problems we have with our healthcare system. It's subject to political maneuvering rather than being right that people have access to regardless of their individual means, their economic means. Currently, we're all paying for health care for people who can't afford to pay it because they go to the emergency room and they incur costs that we cover through primarily insurance that those who are insured have to make sure that the hospitals stay solvent. What I propose and what I advocate for, and I'm not sure who else up on this panel might advocate for it, but I advocate for a single-payer system. It's going to create efficiencies in how health care is delivered. It's going to create a more fair system that allows access to everyone. And for folks who are not satisfied with the current Affordable Care Act, it solves some of the problems because there is no mandate. Health care is available to everyone. And so that's one thing that I would do that would ensure that not only women, but everyone has access to health care, including the contraceptive, the family planning type care. It removes it from the political world and it puts it into the realm where everybody has access to affordable care. It'll be more efficient. That's what I support. That's what I will support in Congress.
I think that we shouldn't be allowed to have laws that discriminate based on gender. And if it's whatever their proposals are coming by, I'll be against any form of discrimination. And I believe that's what they're trying to do with some of their arguments against the healthcare reform bill. But I do think before we can go to a single payer system, we need to figure out how to make it work, because the government run healthcare services like the VA and IHS, they need some major improvements because they are not efficient, they're not working. Their quality of healthcare in them facilities are nowhere near what they are in the private sector. So until we can figure out how to get those programs to provide the same quality of health care as the private sector, it's very dangerous to go down the single payer route.
So I'll just get it out there right now. I am unequivocally a supporter of women's reproductive rights and the opportunity for women to make their own decisions about their health care. As far as the Affordable Care Act, I can say, again, unequivocally, that the provisions in there that allow for and provide for low cost or no cost contraceptives or other health care measures for women is absolutely something that we need to retain. And I will, I guess along those lines also, to follow up on the question, I think that it is a wrong-headed move to go down the path of somehow feeling as if we should not support through our tax dollars anything that we have some moral objection or objection in conscience to. If that were the case, I would not have paid my taxes for the last decade that have been siphoned off to support wars overseas that have depleted the national coffers and cost many lives in the process. The second part of this question, though, referred to what would I do in Congress. Well, one tangible thing would be I would continue to support and fund Planned Parenthood and those educational measures that we take to make sure that folks know about health care, women's health, contraception. We cannot defund education.
Well, I guess serving in the legislature for the last 16 years has given me a preview of the war against women that now seems to be shifting its focus to the U.S. House of Representatives. We've wrestled with a lot of these issues, like allowing a pharmacist who doesn't believe in birth control to opt out, to trying to standardize sex education or put restrictions on it, to just eliminating any type of funding for women's health care. And that probably was the hallmark of the 2011 session, trying to eliminate the funding for Planned Parenthood. And I'm proud to say that in all of the sessions, I stood firmly in support of women's health care, of a woman's rights to choose. And 7 out of my 8 sessions, I had a 100% voting record with NARAL on Planned Parenthood. So I will continue that fight and continue that advocacy. In fact, in my own community in the Billings Heights, Planned Parenthood purchased a clinic from one of the local hospitals and started to open up a Planned Parenthood, which they were successful in doing. However, that was 6 years ago. And a lot of the religious leaders came to me because I was a state legislator and I had a background in urban planning and said, "Won't you help us try to zone them out?" I couldn't believe it. So when I went on my next campaign, door to door, I made sure that everyone knew that I thought Planned Parenthood was an advantage to our community, and I'll continue to do so.
I oppose a religious entity's ability on moral or religious grounds to withhold or not provide preventative health care for women. Including birth control, mammograms, all preventative care. And I didn't hear the second part of the question, but I assume it's been answered, so I'll pass the mic.
Every time I hear this question, I wonder, so if you're an employer and you object to population growth, can you deny coverage for pregnancy? This only comes up because it's being used as this political issue to achieve a political end. Because I guarantee you that on the flip side of this, if that question comes out, the answer is going to be a resounding no. So we need to get mad about this, because this is something that is sacred, that a woman's health choices are hers, between her and her doctor. I've told this story before. I have been married for 31 years to the wonderful man back there with the camera, not this gentleman. Hi, don't know you though. But the other one. And I'm a mom. I've had an amnio and an emergency C-section, and I got to make those choices in the toughest of circumstances with me and my doctor. Not me and my doctor and my employer, me and my doctor. That's where this is, and that's where it is imperative that it should stay. And if I have to go to Capitol Hill and tell those stories 1,000 times, then that's what I'll do.
There is a war against women's rights. There's no question about it. It's front and center right now. So I think the questions were, where am I on that, and what about the reproductive and health care and the coverage for women's reproductive health? And thirdly, what would I do in Congress? Well, where am I as I'm 100% pro-choice, unwavering, uncompromising, and my record in the Montana State Legislature, and the only person running this race who is. Secondly, about women's reproductive health and rights, it's not just about birth control, it's also about breast cancer screening. We had community health centers closed down and defunded because of the last session in the legislature. So there are a broad range of reproductive health issues that must be protected one way or another. And absolutely, I support the Patient Affordability and Accessibility Health Care Act and don't want to see that come undone. I have written about a Medicare for All program. It's been published as an editorial. Happy to send it to anyone who's interested. And thirdly, what would I do in Congress? I understand the Constitution, and I would defend those rights very courageously, strongly, and uncompromisingly. First of all, we have that we did not give the government the right to make our reproductive decisions. So from a conservative viewpoint, you can't tell me that you've given the government this right. Secondly, it is the right to privacy, the right on which the current right to abortion rests that must be upheld. And thirdly, I think that's under attack. We have to talk about the First Amendment and religious freedom, and you can't answer the question about abortion or personhood or ensoulment without appealing to religious doctrine. Therefore, the government cannot answer the question and interfere with that decision.
Well, how you doing? You all right out there? Seats comfortable? Is it too warm? Is it too warm? No? It's okay? Say it again. Yeah. Yeah, I made a mistake. It's not my first one, but I got all dressed up. These events.
Pat, were you talking about hot air from us?
Who, me?
No, from us.
Sometimes, well, let me say on behalf of Jen and I that we didn't mean that you couldn't applaud. We just thought that it sounded almost, the applause sounded almost obligatory, like you had to applaud each person. You don't have to do that. If you want to throw a shoe, throw a shoe. You think, some of you are going like this, but your hands aren't going together, we notice. And so if you want to applaud, applaud. That's okay. Yeah, big heavy boots. Well, they've learned to duck, I'll tell you. Sometimes sometimes politics in a warm room, and I guess it's not warm, so we're okay, but uncomfortable seats in a warm room in an hour and a half, some debates or political speeches can get kind of wearing, and all the candidates know that, and you know it too, because you come to these occasionally. Politics are not only serious, as they are tonight, but they can also be joyful. And they ought to be joyful, and including debates. So let me tell a brief story. The next question is about military and nuclear capabilities. I was back in Montana about in the middle of my 9 terms, and I'd always come home and go to schools. And my staff keeps saying, Pat, look, you're going to end up losing the next congressional race, and you're going to end up being elected president of the 9th grade. That you can win, but you got to talk to people of voting age. But nonetheless, I'd go around to a lot of schools because I'm a teacher by profession, and I missed the classroom. And I came to a school here in Missoula. I'm sorry to say I've forgotten which one it was, but the whole student body came into the auditorium. And right down front was a kid sitting crossways on the floor. He didn't have enough seats. He's sitting crossways on the floor, a little row of them, but he's right in the middle. And if any of you remember the Our Gang comedies, well, he was the guy with his hair parted in the middle, down the thing, and all the freckles, and the gap, a memorial gap in his teeth, right? And as soon as I said, now, any of you have any questions? Up shot his hand, and every kid looked down like, oh, yeah, he'd be the first one to ask a question. And he said, now this is in the early 90s or late 80s, so it was the partitioning of the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. And he said, Congressman, I understand that the delivery time of a cruise missile to Red Square in the capital of the Soviet Union is 6 minutes, whereas the redundancy time of the America's early warning system is 9 minutes. Don't you think that's destabilizing? True. And you know what he meant. We think we have to fire at him because we see something coming on our radar and other screens, and it turns out it's a flock of geese. But we don't know that till 3 minutes after our cruise missile has landed, right? So this kid was right. But my answer to him was, look, young man, I'm a member of the Budget Committee, and next Wednesday we're going to have Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger come before us, and I'll ask Cap to send you a letter answering that question. And Cap did that, by the way. He sent that kid a letter. So here you go, gang. This is from one of our sponsors who became a late sponsor and unfortunately didn't make it on our program. But Pi Sigma Alpha Epsilon Mu asked this question. If negotiations with Iran do not lead, let's say you were in the Congress right now. That's how this question's framed, I think. Let's say you're in the Congress now and negotiations with Iran do not lead to an adequate, safe agreement over their nuclear capability. Should the U.S. consider a military strike to stop that country's nuclear development? Where do we start, Jen? Where are we? Jason? Yes? You can't ask Cap Weinberger to answer this. You gotta do it
We've been under the threat of nuclear weapons my whole life. So it's not a new thing, but it is something that should be avoided if at all possible. And I do think that it should be on the table, but I really believe that if before we send troops anywhere, it's Congress's job to decide that. They're the ones that are supposed to make the call whether to go to war or not. And it's been a long time since we've held to them standards and actually made Congress make that decision. We've been through conflict since Vietnam without having to declare war. And that's something I'll be arguing against firmly.
So based on the question as it was presented, adequate and safe agreement, my answer is no. We've had a great track record, haven't we, in terms of detecting weapons of mass destruction over the past decade. In the process of the last decade's worth of military adventurism abroad, we have lost respect on the international stage. We have depleted the coffers in this country to the tune of in excess of $1 trillion. We've lost many a young man and woman's life in conflict. We do not need to be getting back into a major conflagration of a war in the Middle East at this stage. We need to depend more on diplomacy, and only as an absolute last resort, a clear last resort, should we use military force.
I agree with what Dave has said. I had a similar response, is that we've already been through the drama of evidence or lack of evidence of weapons of mass destruction. I guess one of my concerns is, and I do respect all their 12.6% of Montanans have military duty, and I don't want my comments to in any way diminish that the dedication that those folks have done, and I mean that sincerely. But when we say that negotiations haven't worked, I think I've become a little concerned that what are the negotiations? Because, as we know, we've been engaged in some wars over what most of us feel are nothing more than petropolitics. And it's less about nuclear weapons and more about oil and gas. And so I would have the same hesitation, and not until I felt that Congress or those negotiating on behalf of the United States had exhausted every single possible option would I even consider the need that, or not the need, but the fact that or voting on whether we should go to war again. And I say that not only as someone who's been in a public service, but I also say that as a mother, and I look around the room and I see lots of young people in this room, and I don't know whether I would be at the point where I want to say to them, go off and fight for more petropolitics for the United States.
If you've looked at the biography, you've seen it. I'm a combat infantry soldier from Vietnam, so I'm aware of the ugliness of war. I would not support intervention or military strike against Iran at this point. But we have another problem. Our Israeli ally, and they very well may strike. They're going to drag us in if, in fact, they do. I don't know how many of you realize how small of a country Israel is. If you look at the Middle East, you can hardly see that country. They would be destroyed on a first strike. Completely destroyed, and that's their concern. And they're our ally, so I do not know what's going to happen, but I think it's up to the Israelis. But I would not support military intervention with the primary attack from the United States of America.
Well, first, thank you for your service. I agree with what's been said. While you never take the military option off the table, and obviously what's going on with your allies is extremely important, we have to turn our attention back home. You know, the flight attendant's first rule is you put your own oxygen mask on first, and then you walk up and down the aisle of the plane and you put other people's oxygen masks on. And as wonderful a job as our military does protecting us all the time, and they do, we have to turn our attention back home. It's time. So I agree. There are circumstances here that we're not going to control, obviously. And so when you don't control all the circumstances, you never eliminate an option. But having said that, this is not a time. Our military is stretched. They're fatigued. We've put them under enormous strain with the battles that we've had up to this point. And we really need to have respect for that, too.
First of all, I would never support an undeclared war. I would never support military operations that don't have a clearly defined objective. And if it's a matter of international security, the United States never need go it alone. So let me be clear about that. Secondly, however, we do need a non-proliferation regime internationally that's enforceable. That was the lesson, unfortunately, also lost in the case with Iraq. We have 190 countries that have joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty and 4 countries that haven't, and they are of concern. North Korea is another one, and Iran, obviously. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace advocated in the 1990s, when we were trying to establish an enforceable non-proliferation regime in Iraq, what they called coercive inspections. And by the way, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, is currently doing inspections in 90 countries on a very small budget. And we did learn that at least Mohammed el-Baradei, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize, as head of the IAEA, did have a very good idea that there were no weapons of mass destruction programs that were viable in Iraq in 2003 and 2002. So what we need to do is find ways to strengthen that regime, to make it enforceable, and mobilize and use United States leadership in the international community to develop a coalition of political will to support an enforceable non-proliferation regime, because there's a lot of material out there, there's a lot of failed states, and a lot of risk, and we need not live with that risk. And we need a more secure world that locks down the material, we know where it is, and engage constructively with these countries.
So I apologize in advance. I'm going to try to address two things in my answer here. See if I can pull it off. In response to the previous question, I just want to be clear. I'm one of the people who doesn't have a 100% legislative record voting on women's issues, and that's because I've never been in the legislature. I've never held elected office before, and I've never run for a partisan office before. But I do have a very solid record of standing up for the Constitution as the chief legal counsel for the Montana legislature, including the right of privacy, including our public education system, and all those other things that I talked about earlier. So in response to the previous question, I just don't want the suggestion to be out there that I'm something less than a 100% voting record for any other reason. With regard to Iran, as I understand the question is, should we consider a strike against Iran if negotiations fall through? And my answer is absolutely. We should absolutely be considering the threat that foreign countries have to the United States. I mean, this is part of what the Constitution demands of the federal government, is to provide for the common defense. And so that doesn't mean that we should attack Iran. That doesn't mean that we should, mobilize troops unnecessarily. But absolutely, we should be considering threats to the United States. And so this is what the Department of Defense does. And even if we're not at the forefront of, an imminent attack, I think that the Department of Defense needs to be strong enough to consider the different scenarios and be able to respond.
Aren't you guys all lucky that Pat Williams decided to moderate this debate? His anecdotes. So while I'm up here, please no shoes, because I know what Montanans wear on their feet. The next question comes from Women's Voices of the Earth. We're going to go ahead and start with Ms. Gillen and go to the right. So Dave, you will be next, okay? It seems like every day we hear about harmful chemicals in consumer products, whether it is BPA in canned food linings or harmful flame retardants in baby mattresses and car seats. Considering that chemicals like these disproportionately impact women and children's health and are linked to cancer, developmental harm, learning disabilities, and more, do you support strengthening the Toxic Substance Control Act to require manufacturers to test chemicals for safety before they are allowed in products? Ms. Gillen?
Thank you. I emphatically support that, not just as a mother, but as someone who during the 2009 legislature volunteered to have my hair tested for mercury. And if I'm correct, I don't know whether I want bragging rights about this, I had the highest concentration of mercury. And it was... I won't say it's eye-opening, because I always knew about mercury in thermometers, and having raised 2 children was always concerned about that. But it maybe then prompted me to do some research as to why I might have this high mercury concentration. Was it because of the mercury concentration found in fish, and I'd lived in the Midwest for a while, or was it from foods or other types of aspects? And so I wouldn't say I was a convert. I've always been careful about nutritional labels, but I realize with the level of toxicities that we need federal legislation. We don't only need it, but we need it to be enforced. And that's the problem sometimes. We pass something and then it doesn't get enforced, and that means funding the agencies to make sure that there is compliance. As many of you may know, in 2009, I carried the insurance mandate for autism. The incidence of autism is up incredibly, and there is also a concern that it may be linked to toxins in the environment. So I am 100% in supporting the legislation and funding enforcement.
My answer also is an emphatic yes, as opposed to those who might look at ways to deregulate in this country. We need to be about regulating smartly, regulating to keep the common good intact and to protect public safety and health. So whether we're talking about labeling for cosmetics, food products, we need to know what are in those products. And secondarily, we need to ban and prohibit those products that are harmful to our kids, to all of us in this society.
We need to ensure that our products are safe. And really, I think it's the government's job to monitor that, because this is the lead poisoning inflicted on our children by Chinese corporations. We should have caught that earlier. And we shouldn't ever trust foreign companies importing into the United States to tell us it's safe or not. We need to make sure of it ourselves. And if they're known to have a history of poisoning us, we should test them more often. And that's really a common sense way to approach things. I don't really think manufacturers should test their own products. I mean, they've never lied to us before, right?
I'd be inclined to support the legislation, but I'd want to read it first, and I'd want to be in Congress and have that debate, get the input from the different sides. I haven't read it, and so I can't commit to the principles in it because I think the legislative process is important. But let me tell you why I'd be inclined to support it. I'm a big fan of Women's Voices for the Earth. It's an organization that started back in the 90s right here in Missoula and has gone on to be one of the most valuable voices across the country, across the world, for household chemical safety and some other issues too, but household chemical safety in particular. And I know this because I keep track of what they do, but also because in my campaign, I stopped by their headquarters because it was important for me to hear the issues that they're working on and to get that input so that I can make an informed decision about some of the issues that I should be paying attention to in the campaign. And I kind of feel bad because I missed a Twitter event that Women's Voices for the Earth was having tonight at 6 o'clock, but I decided to come to the forum instead. But Women's Voices for the Earth is really a leading organization, and I've followed what they've done, and it's the type of voice I will listen to when legislation of this nature comes up.
Like the other candidates here, I think we're all very strong supporters of this kind of testing. It's passed on to the fetus and then to the child, of course, as health impairments and health risks. There's also a very strong correlation between poverty and those risks of environmental exposure. And Winona LaDuke, who some of you may know, was one of the forefront leaders in bringing her research to public light on what she called environmental racism, which was the location of highly toxic industrial activity in low-income and therefore often minority neighborhoods. And she was testing, of course, first Native American and reservation places where, because people, their lack of jobs and income, and often are in a position to accept some toxic dumping and nuclear waste in Nevada and so forth. So it's a hugely important issue, and it has broader implications in addition to just testing the chemicals. And thank you, Jason. I love the way you put that. We can trust them. They always have to trust me.
Yes, and I would support the testing. I'd even go farther. I have a vision for 21st century government where we use the internet in a way that allows us to have greater access to information on a real-time basis. And so we can disclose this stuff. We can mandate disclosure of this now so that people have access to it. And they can punch it up on the internet and find exactly what it is that they're looking for in terms of what the chemical makeup is of the product that they're using, or how things are put together. I think that's so important. And again, I think the federal government can take a really good lead here and be very effective and efficient at getting that information out to the consuming public.
Well, we know that testing for infants, it goes back to that point that I said about having kids ready for school. And this is definitely something that, even though I'm more of a well, I think there's two things that this country needs to deal with, and whoever will win, should deal with. And then one is the big money's stranglehold on our government and doing things for corporate America as opposed to the individuals and people like us, the common voter. And the, I can't remember what it was, but simply that the funding for this, even though we're in a shrinking pie kind of environment because of China and India, we will in fact get an economic pie growing bigger, but right now it is in fact shrinking. That this is one area where I would probably, well, I would, because I believe with the children and increasing them and getting them ready for school, which I mentioned earlier, this fits into that preschool health and prenatal health and all those other items. So I would support that, and with Kim also for regulation, support enough funding so that in fact the law can be implemented through regulation.
This question is submitted by the Pride Foundation. It's about DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. And the question begins with Pride's concern about the Defense of Marriage Act, which they say singles out lawfully married same-sex couples for unequal treatment under federal law. This law discriminates in two ways. It prohibits states from recognizing valid same-sex civil marriages, Section 2. Also, it removes all same-gender couples, regardless of their marital status, from all federal statutes, regulations, and rulings applicable to other married people. And that denies more than 1,100 federal benefits and protection. That's under Section 3 of DOMA. So the question, if elected to Congress, would you support the full repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act? Where are we going to start, Jim? This fellow here, David.
I hope you're sitting down when you hear this. I believe firmly in same-sex marriage, and one of my first acts in Congress would be to work with my colleagues to repeal fully DOMA. I'd go further than that. I would build on what we have accomplished here in Missoula, Montana, and make sure that across this nation nobody is discriminated against on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. We need to get beyond this. In the 21st century, I cannot believe that we are still haggling over this issue, so you can count on me to work for equality across the board in this nation.
I am pretty sure you're probably going to get a lot of the similar answers here, but really this, I think, really shows the hypocrisy of a lot of our current congressmen. They talk about limited government and keeping the federal government out of individual lives. And really, this is a pretty intrusive bill. And that's, I think, I don't see how really anybody can support it.
I support the repeal of DOMA, and let me explain to you why I think Montanans support the repeal of DOMA. We've got our state constitution, and among the values in it is we have equality of opportunity, and we voted on that, and we decided that we like it, and so we kept it. But we also have state constitutional provision that treats marriage as one man, one woman, and we put that in the state constitution, and I actually personally disagree with that. But this is what Montanans have told us. And what does that tell us about federal law? That tells us that Montanans have defined marriage in a way here in the state, and as Jason pointed out, we don't want the federal government telling us what to do. And so that means to protect what Montanans have done in our state constitution, which I personally disagree with, we have to repeal DOMA because that's the federal government defining marriage for us. And so the first thing that we need to do is we need to repeal DOMA, get the federal cap off the definition of marriage, and we need to work at a state level, as we've done in Washington and New York and Vermont and elsewhere, state-by-state basis to achieve marriage equality. And so I think it's a two-step process. The voters in Montana have told me that they don't want a federal definition because we've defined it here in Montana. I personally support equality of opportunity for all, including same-sex marriage, and I think I'm on the right side of history here because when the military accords equality of opportunity for all, you know that the fight is nearly over.
Democrats have always stood for equal rights and civil rights, and that was true of my formative years and the things that frame my political commitments. I won't tell you when, a long time ago. All of us have friends and family members who are injured and denied equal rights on the basis of sexual orientation across a variety of activities that are fundamental to being human, like being married, or having a job without being discriminated against, or the act of hate crimes. So let me tell you what I've done in my own career in public service. As chair of the Montana Human Rights Commission, I sent a letter to the Montana State Legislature urging the inclusion of sexual orientation in our Hate Crimes Act, urging the inclusion of sexual orientation in our Montana Human Rights Act, and in the legislature, and that was before I served, I sponsored and carried a bill, unsuccessfully didn't pass, to provide for domestic partnerships in Montana, including educating the legislature on the difference between the rights that are accorded to marriage and domestic partners. It's quite striking. So no one should think that that's the answer or the solution to the problem. So we have to repeal DOMA. We have to educate and open up that discussion. My own opinion about the Constitution is that DOMA violates full faith and credit by not giving recognition to the acts of one state across state lines and another. So it's the right thing to do. I think everyone up here will be on the right side of the issue.
As a lawyer, I could go into the multiple ways that DOMA fails constitutionally, but let's not. Instead, let's talk about this past summer when David and I were in the wedding party for our friends Mike and Tom, when they got married in Montana after 22 years of being together. And that was the good news, because it was a great day, and Montanans across the Northwest came out to support this union, and it was wonderful. The bad news is that it wasn't recognized legally, which was just silly. But the best part of this wedding, though, is that by the two of them taking that step and doing this publicly in Montana and making a stand for it, the week before the wedding, a young man who'd struggled with being out with his sexuality was sitting on our sofa. He's a friend of our daughter's, and he's sitting on our sofa, and he says, "I hope that my husband is bilingual and can cook." Without a moment's hesitation. And that's why it's important. And it's important to fight for this. It's important to put real faces on it. And it's important for all of us to not just talk the talk, but to walk the walk whenever we have that opportunity.
Every human being has unique worth and must be given a fair and equal opportunity to fulfill his potential. I support the right to hold one's personal beliefs without interference from those with different beliefs. I'm on record as supporting repeal of DOMA in its complete form. And that, in fact, would play back into what I talked about earlier, preparing kids, if they, in fact, same-sex marriage, have children, preparing them for school, a warm, family-friendly environment, stability, and that adds to it, which helps the nation in the educational realm.
I think, as Dave said, that sometimes it's difficult to believe that we're in the 21st century and people still have these incredibly parochial views. I mean, what do you say or what do you think? In this last session, I carried what I thought was a fairly innocuous bill to have school districts develop anti-bullying policies. I share the story because all of a sudden it got mixed up, and it was these hearings were shocking because people would get up who were against the bill to have anti-bullying and say that it would be violating their First Amendment rights. And then there was just a litany of proponents of the bill, which basically just required a policy. And Montana is one of the last states not to have any kind of strong anti-bullying policy. And they would tell these stories about how they had been persecuted for being slightly different and on many spectrums. And it was really a very troubling situation. Of course, as with all my colleagues, I would support repeal. And I also hope that as we go forward, that we begin to have, you can repeal the legislation, you need to enforce it, but then you also need to have it personally to take on the commitment that you're going to speak out, speak against, and speak up when you hear these comments. And I heard that from some young people that came to testify in support of the bill. So we're all in this together, and I think some of it's going to have to be individualized to just stand up against this. And so legislatively, I'd repeal it, but also I'm going to work hard, and I will continue to work hard against these kind of narrow perspectives.
As a daughter of 2 public school teachers, they always taught me that when an audience starts to get glazy eyes, to stand up and do head and shoulders, knees and toes. Now, because we want to maintain respectability, we will not do that. However, I will tell you that this is your opportunity to raise those yellow cards, and a moderator will come, not a moderator, I'm sorry, a facilitator will come and grab those cards, because we have, there they are. Oh my gosh. The immense depth that we have had from our sponsor organizations' questions tonight has been great, and we are excited to field your questions tonight. This is the last question. So, while I know that all of your waving was a first part of head and shoulders, knees and toes, we will go on to the last question. Now, this is how political debates... No, but you can wiggle all you want. Now, this is how moderators at political debates have some fun. Are you guys excited to toss this up? So we're going to test. This is more like a duck, duck, goose, not head, shoulders, knees, and toes. We're going to test. We're actually going to start with Mr. Rankin and go every other person to the left. Right? Oh, yeah. Here we are. Which should end with Mr. Strohmeyer then going back every other person. Capiche? All right. You'll figure it out. And even if you don't, it's fine. Montana women vote. Last question from the organizations. Currently, we face a situation where even as the U.S. is running a deficit and carries debt, poor and working people pay disproportionate amount of taxes. What is your plan to invest in our communities in order to make them safe, strong, and healthy? Mr. Rankin?
You know, I haven't, I'll probably end up agreeing with a lot of what these other people say, but I'm the pie is getting smaller thought, and so my reaction, I don't have any specific legislation that I would propose or that I can think of, except for that the pie would not be shrunk with any of the programs that in fact impact low-income people, in fact, mostly with children especially. So I wouldn't, I can't think of anything I would propose, and I don't have any that I've thought of, but I would definitely prepare or keep the funding levels of the poor and infant children's programs at the same level, even though I would propose many other programs to be cut.
Okay, I get it. I'm next. You know, first of all, in this country, people who work, and everyone wants the dignity of work, by the way. No one wants to be living in a situation where they don't feel useful and productive, and that in return for that, they can provide a decent life for themselves. So it's hard to keep saying we're the greatest country in the world, and I think we can be, and it's the greatest constitutional system in the world. But we need to live up to that promise by making sure that people have basic needs met. And that includes water, adequate nutrition, health care, and shelter. So we start there. There shouldn't be people in need of any of those things. Secondly, we need wages that provide for those things and a system that delivers accessible and affordable health care, period. You shouldn't work and not have those needs met. Along those lines, very concrete policies, the Children's Health Insurance Program. Why don't we extend that to the parents of those children? Those are all working families. People, at both extreme ends of both age and wealth, none and a lot, can afford health care because it's either provided through Medicaid or because they can afford it. It's the people in the middle who don't have it. And that cuts in, 60% of bankruptcies are from medical expenses, just wrong. And finally, education. That is the fastest way to lift people up. And I agree 100%. Pell Grants are not welfare, and accessible, affordable education will help people get the jobs that provide for their needs.
Well, first we need tax reform so that our lower income people aren't burdened with the majority of the taxes. But probably a greater impact would be to start fair trade policies and to protect our industries. Since we started going through down the fair trade policies, we've lost 8 million manufacturing jobs. And according to the Department of Labor, every manufacturing job creates 1.4 supporting jobs. So that's 20 million jobs, and that's all out of our middle class. If we had them $20 million jobs back, we wouldn't have a deficit problem. We wouldn't have an unemployment problem. For years, we've used creative ways of masking the problem, of pushing it on to the next administration. But really, this was our problem. We've allowed outsourcing to outsource our middle class. If we brought them jobs, everybody would have work. Everybody could afford it. And everybody wouldn't need public assistance. Thank you.
Well, I think what I have always believed is that a strong community comes about if you have a strong economy. And I think it's time that we get serious about the job situation and helping people get back to work. There is a web page that has a ticker running of how many days since the Republicans have been in charge of the U.S. House, and it's been 400 plus days since we really got serious about jobs and job creation. And I say that because right now we know that by investing in education, in job training, in research, and in infrastructure, we will begin to create good-paying jobs that will help create stronger communities. But what is that saying, that the strongest part is only as strong as the smallest part? And as you know, we have a farm bill that the pundits have said won't be passed this year. And the reason I bring up the farm bill is that people are becoming very concerned about food security. 70% of the resources in the farm bill actually deal with programs such as food stamps and nutritional feeding. And I think that instead of postponing that till after the election, we need to get serious about that, because that sends a positive signal to folks that they're going to be able to have food stamps if they need them, access to nutritional food, whether it's in daycare and their families. And last of all, I think that strong communities depend upon everyone getting together in the community and saying, enough of this craziness that's been going on in Washington. Let's get real. Let's move the country forward.
One of the things you learn in business is how to identify a small number of things to do and then set about doing them. Because if you identify too many things to do, the odds of not getting any of them done actually go up pretty high. So I look at this as ensuring our children's futures. Most of that is through public education and ensuring that the public education system works for our kids. Ensuring our children's futures, protecting our seniors' futures through Social Security and Medicare, and protecting those programs and making sure that they work for the long haul. And then revitalizing the middle class through jobs and economic growth. We actually can do that. I hear Sam's point about the pie shrinking, and that ought to be a concern to all of us. Having said that, we live in Montana, in the most innovative state, in the most innovative country on earth. You know, a lot of people don't think about it, but we still own the internet. We own the technologies that have been invented in the last 2 decades. We have not done a good job of making sure that the benefits of that preeminence flows to our middle class. And we have to get very focused on making sure that that happens. And when I go to Congress, that will be a big part of what I focus on every day.
I really like this question because it gives us a chance to sort of wrap up a lot of the things we've talked about and put it in context. And I believe that healthy communities need things like a good education system, and I've talked about some of the work that we've done here in Montana, including work Denise Juneau has done a fantastic job with. And I think that we need healthy households, and I've talked about some of the work that groups like Women's Voices for the Earth have done. And I think that we need a strong health care system, and I've talked about my support of a single payer system. And we've talked about a variety of things. In a previous forum, I talked about the importance of the food safety net. And one of the things I've done in my campaign is I've toured the Montana Food Bank Network headquarters right outside of town here, because that's an important, it's an important consideration for anybody going to Washington. How do we take care of the most vulnerable, the people who have a difficult time taking care of themselves? And I think that one consistent theme that we're hearing is that we've got a table full of people struggling with this idea that there's an important role for government. And we need someone in Washington, we need somebody at the table who understands that. And since Pat was last reelected in 1994, 18 years ago, we haven't had that seat at the table. And so the primary issue is, what are we going to do different this election to make sure that we win in November? What are we going to offer people that distinguishes us from the Republican nominee, presumptive nominee, whose motto is more jobs, less government? And when we look at the cut in the government program some of us are talking about, we realize it jeopardizes our households, our communities, and it jeopardizes our workforce. And I just want to bring that distinction here as we're wrapping up the forum.
Yes. Okay. Don't start the timer yet. So I too believe in government. I believe there's a role for government in our society to further the common good. I also believe that it's anathema that the Republican Party fixates over the expenditure side of the ledger to the exclusion of the revenue side. We need fairness in this country, fair tax system, and we've talked about that in a number of different contexts throughout the questions tonight. Every week I work in the trenches down here serving the citizens of Missoula in the city council chambers, dealing with questions just like this, usually in spite of what happens in Helena or at the federal level in Washington, D.C. So I believe I'm in a great position to know the ways in which the federal government does or does not work to help further the well-being of the most vulnerable in our society here in Missoula and throughout this country. Let me give you a couple examples. So if any of you value the work of the Missoula Urban Demonstration Project, the work of the PAV, Missoula Aging Services, these are services in our community that are helped by federal programs such as Community Development Block Grants, home grants. We have seen these funding streams slash significantly in the last year or two. You can count on me in Congress, knowing from the trenches here in Missoula that these programs absolutely work and they need to continue into the future.
Well, we have read your questions. You're tough. I thought for a minute I was in Butte. First question, I think, Diane, have we started with you yet? I don't think we have. Not yet. Here we go then. You're first. Would it be either practical or possible to get rid of all lobbyists in Washington, D.C.?
It would be desirable. But in fact, I'll tell you an idea. What I actually think, and I said this earlier, I think members of Congress should work 3 weeks a month from their homes and their districts. I don't think they should go to D.C. and become part of that vortex. And I understand that there's an argument for the collegiality and everybody hanging out together and going out for drinks because Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan went out for drinks. Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner live near each other. They're just not going out for drinks. So I actually think that one of the ways to diminish the role of lobbyists is to have the members of Congress stay back home and know what we manage virtually, we Skype business, we do all kinds of stuff these days where we don't have to be physically present with one another. And I just think that the DC system has become so out of whack that one of the ways to deal with it is to stay away from it and to literally stay in your district, stay in Montana. And this goes back to the very, very beginning question. Drive from town to town, talk to the businesses, find out what we're doing, talk to the folks that are schooling their kids and find out what it is that they need. So I think that would be one way to address it.
Me?
I think. I'm so confused. That's good.
Is that right?
There is definitely one way to get rid of all of the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. They sell a drug called money. And if you get the people that don't take the drug, there won't be any lobbyists. You need to elect someone like me who has been fighting for this kind of a thing for 25 years, and it's finally now getting some cachet in the public. It may not be this time, but one of these years, the voters are going to elect politicians who do not use money to win elections and are not addicted to it. So when they get to D.C., they will have absolutely no reason to go to a fundraiser, and the lobbyist will not call them. And that's how you get rid of the lobbyist.
You know, I won't comment on whether it's practical or possible to get rid of the lobbyists, but I think the answer is simply elect people who are willing to stand up to them and vote the desires and the concerns and the needs and the priorities of everyday Montanans. And I don't understand why that is so difficult. We have legislators who get elected every other year, every 4 years. A couple of them are in this room. And every time they're up at the legislative session, they face a lot of pressure from lobbyists, but they continue to vote the needs of Montanans and also the needs of Missoulian. I think that if you elect principled people who tell you they're not just going to talk the talk, but they're also going to walk the walk. And that's the one thing that I will share, that during my 16 years in the legislature, I've been elected from a tough district. It's a district with called a swing district, which is a code word for probably more Republicans than Democrats, but I've continued in leadership and in my votes to uphold democratic principles and democratic values. So you just don't worry about the lobbyists. You elect someone who's going to say, thank you, but you can talk to one of my aides. And that's the simple answer.
So I don't think it's neither practical nor possible to completely eliminate lobbyists. In this country, in this republic, you have the right, constitutional right, to petition Congress. So let's be clear what we're talking about when it comes to lobbyists. I think all of us here on this panel today are pretty clear that money ought not to be playing the role in lobbying that it is in this country, but the city of Missoula, we hire a lobbyist to go over to Helena and to petition to the legislature every session because, heck, I have a job. I can't be driving over to Helena every day, nor do my colleagues on the city council. So it's a mechanism for an organization. It could be a nonprofit that you love dearly. It's a mechanism to get your message out. Having said that, though, I think it is clear to me that the level of influence and power that corporations play into the political system, their lobbyists play, is truly a tragedy and needs to be addressed firmly in this country. And for me, a piece of that is stating clearly and loudly that corporations are not persons and that money is not speech. So we need to address Citizens United head on. We need to make sure that we continue efforts, however long it's going to take, to have a constitutional amendment that declares that corporations are not persons and extract the money element out that is tempting folks because you have to raise money to run for re-election. Get the money out of politics.
I think if you took all the lobbyists out of Washington, it'd be a fairly lonely place. But I don't really see in the near future them leaving. But you know, I'm not a complex person. When they paid me to drill a well, I drilled a well. When they paid me to build a road, I built a road. when you pay me to represent you in Washington, I'll represent you. And we have a saying here in Montana, ride for the brand. And I think that's what we have to do.
So my response actually sounds like quite a bit of what other people have said. Diane said that we need to use social media and technology to make sure that we really stay in touch with what our constituents want, not what the lobbyists want, and I agree with that. Sam says we need to say no to the special interest money, and I agree with that. I don't take any. What did you say, Kim?
Elect people who stand up.
Elect people who stand up. Thank you. I'm sorry. It's just brain. So, yeah, I think we do need to elect people who are willing to take strong positions, even if they're not politically inconvenient. And it's politically inconvenient to tell lobbyists that you don't want their money and you won't sign their pledges, but it's the right thing to do because it shows whose team you're on. And I think that Dave has a very good point that we need to continue to fight against Citizens United, and that's a leading issue here in Montana. Our Attorney General, Steve Bullock, is fighting against the corporate influence in the courts, and our junior Senator, John Tester, is proposed and he's pushing a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. And I think that we should resonate the same issue at the House, on the House seat, and we do that by saying, no, we won't take the money. Same message, 3 approaches, and I think it's powerful. And, Jason has it exactly right. You've got to not just tell people you're working for them, you've got to show them, and that's what I've done with my campaign.
Pride has a lobbyist. The NAACP has a lobbyist. Nurses, where's Teresa? Did she leave? Have lobbyists. And there's Carolyn. The problem is not human rights groups have lobbyists. It's not lobbyists. It's regulating their influence. I'm really generally giving you a list of people who are less well-funded lobbyists. We know the problem is the well-funded, infinitely funded lobbyists, and that's why we're all also talking about campaign finance reform and Citizens United. That decision is a disaster. And the people in this country have a lot more to worry about since the recession of 2008 and the slow recovery than to add to the problem that the people who caused it, which were corporations in the private sector and banks, to have even more influence than they have already. So I don't know if a constitutional amendment is going to fix it before another Supreme Court decision is going to fix it. Something needs to fix it. And in my view, only living, breathing human beings should vote, run for office, and speak in this country. And I think the Founding Fathers had the same thing in mind.
We're going to continue with our citizenry tough questions. Ms. Gillen, you will start with this one, and then we'll go to the left. Climate change is one of our biggest long-term threats. How will you work to secure energy and work to stabilize our climate?
Well, I think first that interesting enough, when everyone was talking about a warm winter we were having, I guess there was a poll that showed that if you asked Democrats, they thought it was climate change, and if you asked Republicans, they simply said, oh, I guess we're having a warm winter. So I thought, not very scientific, but it was a little bit humorous. I think the important thing is that as a nation, we've tackled issues like going to space travel, other things, but we've never done it in the area of energy. We don't have a comprehensive energy plan. I actually tried to get one passed in 1999 in the Montana legislature, and I think that we need to focus on how we can expand our renewable resources. Right now, in the short term, we are still dependent upon traditional fossil fuels. So if we put together a comprehensive energy plan and also put the resources behind it, that is the money, to make sure that we continue to invest in R&D in expanding renewable resources. Here in Montana, we have camelina as the feedstock for biodiesel, which is very, very promising. We've done some incredible things in the Montana legislature, although last session we almost lost some of them, to make sure that we begin and continue to develop Montana renewable resources. And I have to admit, I think we need to invest more in looking at, are there ways to develop clean coal technology?
Carbon-based energy suppliers have large government subsidies that are no longer justified, and I will work towards elimination of those subsidies. This will bring renewable energy development costs in line because, in essence, the energy that we pay, the energy that we get will end up costing somewhat more. But that would spur the energy for renewable energy development, and true cost of energy will encourage rapid economic feasibly developmental carbon sequestration, use of biofuels, and energy conservation, and of course solar and wind power development. The ultimate impact of all this would be to help the environment. Well, then the one program that can make a huge difference that isn't expensive for most of us, and we all know about it, and we'd probably do more of it, in fact, if energy was slightly more expensive, which it might be after I get rid of the energy companies' subsidies, would be energy efficiency. Every time my bill goes up, I consistently either winterize more or somehow figure a way to conserve and not pay those guys that extra money. And so the climate change is the beneficiary of all of this, which has increased a slight amount of energy because our country does pay a lot less than the true cost of energy.
In the early 80s, I went to work for a small long-distance company that was trying to compete against the about-to-be-broken-up Bell system. And that company grew up to be Sprint. And the reason why I tell that story now is because AT&T wasn't at all happy about being broken up into 8 pieces. I think it was 8. And they fought against it. They fought enormously hard against it. And we've all seen the outcome, right? They're now a mobile company. We have internet guys all over the place. The industry's flourishing. Energy looks similar to me. And there are opportunities for us to create the environment where new alternative players can thrive. But we do very little about that. I open my car door in Whitefish, Montana, and I knock over some guy who's inventing a new biofuel. We're working on, we have algae, we have sawgrass, wheatgrass, wood chips, you name it, it's all going on. And one of the things we have to do is work harder to move those products from the garage, where they're kind of a science experiment, to the grid, where they're an industry success, and where we can use them to integrate with the legacy fossil fuels companies in order to be able to bring down prices and also wean us off of fossil fuels. There are a lot of steps that we can take in there to make that happen, and the faster that we start working on it, the faster we'll be successful.
I think the initial question was about climate change as a long-term threat, and I'd like to say I think it's a short-term threat as well, not just a long-term threat. And I've written an editorial about that as well if you'd like to see it sometime. You know, we have this situation in Montana where we have the beetle kill, if you don't think it's a short-term threat. We have glaciers disappearing if you don't think it's a short-term threat. And I think most of you all know Steve Running and the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. They had 2 conclusions with a 99% degree of confidence. That is higher than it takes to have confidence to build a bridge with engineering knowledge. It's higher than the confidence that we use to label cigarettes as causing cancer. It's hugely high. It's certain. It's so certain. One is more warmer and fewer colder days over most of the Earth's surface, and the second is more precipitation events. The combination of just those 2 variables alone is threatening our security, national security. It's at that level of a problem. I think the link between energy and climate change is a very short-term need. We have to make that link, and one way to do it is to say that any new energy project proposal has to include a proposal for offsetting and reducing carbon emissions. You can plant 1,000 trees. I don't care what you do. You have to say you're going to do something to have a net effect on carbon reduction. I've advocated for both diverse sources of energy and diverse sources of modes of production and transmission. We need to keep that diversity. We have short-term and long-term prospects, and I'm also a very strong advocate of public ownership of energy resources.
The great political mind, Dick Cheney, once said that Conservation might be the basis, it might be a personal virtue, but it's not the basis of a sound public policy. And I disagree with that. I think that conservation has to be an important part of any sound national policy. The great political mind, Sarah Palin, once said, "Drill, baby, drill." And I've got to say I disagree with that. I think that reckless drilling and mining of natural resources is to everyone's detriment, not only short-term but long-term. And so there are positions I take in my campaign that make sure that the extractive resources are done in a way that's environmentally friendly. And the great political mind, George W. Bush, once said, "Fool me once, shame on me, shame on you." Let's start over. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, we won't be fooled again. And let's not be fooled again. There's a real difference between what we've got up here on the stage looking for solutions to climate change and what the Republicans are offering. And so let's not be fooled again into thinking that the general election isn't important. And so on one issue, Keystone, I support a pipeline that runs up to the Bakken field, but not up to the Alberta tar sands because it decouples the economic benefits in Montana from the environmental problems with the development of the Alberta tar sands. My position is very clear.
The simple fact is, even if we completely stop polluting, it wouldn't help. Because look at everything we buy. It's imported. And as long as they're polluting, they're destroying our earth. And so unless we start building here where we can regulate the pollution levels that are coming out of the industries that produce the stuff we buy, then all of our regulations don't help any. We need to produce our energy here where we can regulate it and make sure that it's produced in a responsible way. And we need to develop new alternative energies. And I haven't just talked about it. I have camelina in the ground right now. I'll have biodiesel this year. We will also, China right now is the #1 polluter in California. Over 50% of the pollution in Hawaii is from Asia. And that just demonstrates that this isn't just America's problem. We have to fix our sourcing. If we do that, then we have a shot at stopping this problem.
So climate change is real, and I would go so far as to say tonight, and we've talked about a lot of important issues tonight, but I believe firmly that climate change is the greatest moral issue facing our times. Some people believe that we have crossed a threshold beyond which we can do nothing to repair the harm that's been done. Some estimate that we need to, as a nation here in the United States, immediately reduce our carbon dioxide emissions in this country by at least 6% per year if we're to do anything in a significant manner to roll back the adverse effects of climate change. What can we do? Well, a couple things. How about if we plow some of the excessive profits of the oil companies back into renewable energy projects in this country? Secondly, something that we have got to do, and believe it or not, we don't have it. We do not have a climate change action plan for this nation. We need to start that like yesterday. And in Congress, that's something that I'll absolutely work on. And let's not kid ourselves. There is no such thing as clean coal. There might be cleaner coal, but we have got to invest heavily in renewable energy sources in this country, invest in energy sources of the 21st century, not the 19th century.
Well, time has conspired to not permit us to ask all of your questions. I'm sorry. We're running, from when we started, we're really running about 6, 8, 10 minutes over, and we ought to try to stay on time. So next time, Chris and Juliana, who put this together. Thank you. Next time, we'll schedule more time for them and less time for us. We're going to conclude with each candidate. We started with Dave with the first question, with the first question, and so we'll start with Kim with the first 30-second closing statement. That was not entirely inappropriate. I'd like to take a minute, seriously, just a minute, to lend a piece of advice. All right? Now, I do this with Republicans too, by the way. I served with 3 speakers, Tip O'Neill, Massachusetts, Jim Wright from Texas, and Newt Gingrich from Georgia. and my advice is really from a story from Tip. He was running for the Massachusetts Assembly, and he lost. He was a young man, he lost. And he was out getting his parents the newspaper out in the yard. The newspaper had been thrown in the morning. And as always, he went out to get it. And as always, on a summer morning, Mrs. Murphy, just over the white picket fence, was out about the same time getting her newspaper, cleaning up her little yard. And Tip's old friends didn't call him Tip, they called him Tom. And Tip's story was, I'm out and I pick up the paper, and she had already seen the paper. I was sitting on the porch reading, and she said, Thomas, I'm very sorry you didn't win the election. And he said, well, it's my first try. He said, it probably won't be my last, but I appreciate it. He said, by the way, Miss Murphy, thanks for your support and thanks for your vote. And she said, oh, Thomas, I didn't vote for you. You know the story? He said, I went over and he said, I put my elbows on the picket fence. He had an Irish temper, too. And he said, Mrs. Murphy, you helped deliver me in this house. I've cut your lawn since I was strong enough and old enough to push that lawnmower. On cold winter days, I hop this fence and I bring the newspaper in to you. You're my family's best friend. What do you mean you didn't vote for me? She said, Thomas, you didn't ask. You didn't ask. So, seriously, you gotta ask. And don't forget to ask your wife or husband. Carol reminds me. We're gonna start with you, Kim, but first we want to thank you for being here, seriously. And thank you very much for your patience. I know some of you realize it's not 8 o'clock and you hung around, and the candidates are very grateful to you. So thanks so much for being here. And again, thanks to you candidates. Kim, 30 seconds, sum it up. We'll come
Great.
right down to David.
When people ask me why I'm running, I always share that Montana has only one voice, and that voice needs to be effective and experienced at getting things done, at problem solving. That's what I've done in the legislature. I've taken on some very difficult tasks, got them done in my professional life and in my community. We have great ideas in Montana. We've heard great ideas on this panel. However, I'm asking for your support because I have a track record of getting things done even in very contentious times at the Montana legislature. I know how to problem solve, and I know how to turn these great ideas into policy and into practical application. So, great ideas, I'll take them to Washington, and I'll make sure that we actually get some things done. So I ask for your support in June and then in November. Thank you.
I'm fighting the conventional wisdom of politicians who think we need more and more money for more and more negative ads. You can check it out on my website. It is true. I am working and running on that plank. I believe to move this great country forward, we need less and less money and less negative ads. If you agree, please vote for me on June 5th.
This election is most likely going to be about jobs and the economy and a vision for government in the 21st century. I have a jobs plan up on the website. Go to Diane Smith from Montana. Also check us out on Facebook, where we have been discussing real topics every single week. This week we took on healthcare. And it's an interesting way to hear feedback from everybody, and it's an interesting way for you guys to see me on the record over and over and over, being very clear about what I'll do and how I think through this. So please support me in June, and I look forward to your support also in November if possible. Thank you for having us here tonight.
Thank you. In the legislature, I've stood up for women, for conservation issues, for veterans, and for teachers. In Congress, I would defend Social Security and Medicare. I would continue my unwavering support for women's right to choose. I'd work for peace and diplomacy. I'd support self-determination and the treaty rights of Montana's First Nations. I'll beat the Republican in this race by standing for something. I will, not against, or I will work with Republicans who are reasonable, but I will never compromise on core values like reproductive rights, Social Security, Medicare, and I would appreciate it if you would vote for me. Thank you.
I'm asking for your support. Get that out of the way. But more importantly, I'm asking for you to make an informed decision about how Democrats are going to win in November. What are we going to do different so that we can contrast ourselves from the Republicans, so after many years we can offer voters something that they're going to buy? I don't take special interest money. He does. I don't sign pledges. He does. I work for a small corporation that I own right here in Montana. He worked for a big corporation out of California. Steve Daines has no public service experience. I've got experience at the local, state, national, international level. Read today's Missoulian letters to the editor if you want to know more about me.
I'm a pretty straightforward, honest guy, and that's what I intend to do. And I want to thank anybody that believes that's what we need, is just somebody that will be straightforward and honest and present Montana values and principles and not compromise on anything that is a principle. I've heard a lot of people talk about compromise for as far as I can remember. But really, if it's a principle, it can't be compromised. If you can compromise it, it's not a principle.
I am no Republican light. If you are looking for something like a Republican, then you best go out and vote Republican and get the real thing. I am a progressive Democrat. I'm proud of it, and I'm raising 2 kids to one day stand here on the U of M campus and say the same thing. In every generation, there comes a moment to seize, a moment to restore a sense of the common good, of common sense, and of commonality. This, my friends, is that moment. It does not make any difference whether you live east or west of the Continental Divide, as some might have you believe, whether you live in the city or the country, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're young or old. We are one Montana that is part of one United States of America, bound together with a common goal to fix Congress and create a government that once again works for us. I ask you to join me.
What a slate of candidates. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you for coming tonight.